a routine patrol with a dark turn. It was a typical evening shift for Officer Dan Mitchell, a veteran of the police force known for his strict adherence to the rules and an often cold demeanor. As he patrolled the streets of his small town, the night seemed uneventful. The city lights reflected off the damp pavement, and the air was thick with the quiet hum of a town settling in for the night. Driving through a quieter part of town, Officer Mitchell noticed a man walking along the sidewalk, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie. Something about the way the man walked, head down, hands in his pockets, caught Mitchell's attention. His instincts, or perhaps his biases, kicked in, and he decided to pull over for a closer look. Flipping on his lights, Mitchell approached the man, a young black man named Jamal Green. Without any clear reason other than a vague suspicion, Mitchell began questioning Jamal aggressively. Jamal, who was on his way home from visiting a friend, was caught off guard but remained calm. However, his polite responses only seemed to agitate Mitchell further. As the interaction continued, it became clear that Mitchell had no legitimate reason for stopping Jamal. Despite this, he escalated the situation, accusing Jamal of looking suspicious and demanding to search him. Jamal, knowing his rights, refused the search, which only infuriated Mitchell more. The encounter quickly turned hostile. Unable to find any evidence of wrongdoing, Mitchell, driven by his own prejudices, decided to arrest Jamal on a vague charge of resisting an officer. Jamal protested, knowing he had done nothing wrong, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Mitchell was determined to assert his authority, even if it meant abusing his power. Jamal was handcuffed and taken to the station, his mind racing with disbelief and fear. He had always heard stories of unjust treatment by the police, but now he was living it. Meanwhile, Officer Mitchell felt a sense of grim satisfaction. To him, it was just another day on the job, maintaining what he saw as order, even if it meant bending the rules. As Jamal sat in the holding cell that night, he couldn't help but wonder how his life had taken such a sudden and unfair turn. Little did he know, this encounter would set off a chain of events that neither he nor Officer Mitchell could have ever predicted. Events that would challenge their perceptions and change their lives in ways they never imagined. The next morning, Jamal's arrest quickly spread through the community. His friends and family were shocked and outraged. Jamal was well known in the neighborhood, a hard-working young man with no criminal record. The news of his arrest on such vague charges didn't sit well with those who knew him. Whispers of injustice began circulating, with many questioning the motives behind Officer Mitchell's actions. Jamal was released on bail later that day, but the experience had already left a deep scar. As he walked out of the police station, he was met by his parents and a few close friends. The relief on their faces was evident, but so was the anger simmering just beneath the surface. They knew Jamal was a victim of racial profiling, and they were determined not to let this go unnoticed. At home, the atmosphere was tense. Jamal's mother, Gloria, was beside herself with worry, while his father, Marcus, was quietly seething with anger. They had raised their son to be respectful, hard-working, and aware of the world's injustices, but they never expected him to be on the receiving end of such blatant discrimination. Jamal, though shaken, tried to reassure his parents. "I'm okay," he said, though the words felt hollow. He knew this was far from over. His father, a former civil rights activist, sat him down to talk about what happened and what they could do next. Marcus was determined to fight back, not just for Jamal, but for every young black man who had been unjustly targeted by those in power. Meanwhile, word of the incident reached the local media. A small community newspaper picked up the story, and soon it was spreading across social media. People from all over the town began to voice their opinions, with some supporting Jamal and others defending the police. The situation was becoming a flashpoint, and tensions were rising. Officer Mitchell, on the other hand, remained unaware of the brewing storm. To him, it was just another arrest, one of many he had made during his career. He dismissed the concerns of those who questioned his actions, confident that his superiors would back him up. But as the days passed, the pressure on the police department began to mount. Unbeknownst to Officer Mitchell, the community was rallying around Jamal, and the incident was about to gain attention far beyond their small town. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge the very foundation of authority and justice in their community. As news of Jamal's arrest continued to spread, the community's response grew stronger. People began to organize, feeling that this incident was a tipping point in a long history of racial tension within the town. The local church, a long-standing pillar of the black community, became the central hub for discussions and planning. Pastor Davis, a respected figure who had been advocating for civil rights for decades, called for a community meeting to address what had happened to Jamal. The church hall was packed that evening. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the pews, their faces a mixture of concern, anger, and determination. Pastor Davis opened the meeting with a prayer for justice, and then handed the floor to Marcus, Jamal's father. Marcus spoke with a calm but firm voice, recounting the events that had led to his son's arrest, and expressing the deep sense of injustice that had settled over his family. "We've seen this too many times," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of years of frustration. "Our sons, our brothers, our fathers, targeted just because of the color of their skin. This isn't just about Jamal. This is about every black man in this town who's been stopped, questioned, and harassed without cause." The crowd murmured in agreement, and as Marcus continued to speak, the room grew more energized. People began sharing their own experiences, and it became clear that Jamal's arrest had touched a nerve. The community had had enough of being marginalized and mistreated, and they were ready to take action. Suggestions flowed freely. Some called for a protest, others for a boycott of businesses that were complicit in racial discrimination. There was talk of legal action against the police department, and several local activists offered to help Jamal's family navigate the process. A sense of unity and purpose began to take hold, and by the end of the meeting, the group had agreed on a plan. They would hold a peaceful march to the police station to demand justice for Jamal and an end to racial profiling. As people began to leave the church, there was a palpable sense of momentum. This was not just a reaction to one incident. It was the beginning of a movement. The community was determined to stand up for Jamal and to send a clear message that they would no longer tolerate injustice. Jamal, who had been quietly listening from the back of the room, felt a surge of emotion. He was deeply moved by the outpouring of support, but he also felt the weight of responsibility. This was no longer just about him. It was about his community, and about making sure that what had happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. As the march was scheduled for the following weekend, preparations began in earnest. Flyers were printed and distributed, social media was flooded with posts about the event, and local businesses that supported the cause offered to help in any way they could. The town was buzzing with anticipation, and it was clear that something significant was about to happen. But while the community was rallying behind Jamal, there were those who opposed their efforts. As the day of the march approached, tensions in the town began to rise, and it became evident that the road to justice would not be easy. As the day of the march drew closer, tensions in the town began to escalate. Not everyone was supportive of the movement sparked by Jamal's arrest. Some of the town's more conservative residents viewed the upcoming march as a disruption and believed that Jamal's arrest was justified. They argued that the police were simply doing their job and that there was no racial bias involved. Rumors began to circulate around town, whispers of counter-protests, threats of violence, and plans to disrupt the march. On social media, heated debates broke out, with some people defending the police and others condemning the systemic racism that Jamal's arrest had brought to light. The town seemed to be dividing into two camps: those who supported Jamal and his family, and those who stood by the police and the status quo. The local news picked up the story, further fanning the flames of division. Reporters interviewed residents on both sides of the issue, and the media coverage only added to the growing tension. Some businesses that had initially expressed support for the march began to backpedal, fearing that being associated with the event might harm their reputation or put them at risk of retaliation. Despite the mounting pressure, Jamal's family and the community leaders refused to back down. Pastor Davis and Marcus met with the police chief to discuss security for the march, hoping to ensure that the event would remain peaceful. However, the meeting did little to ease their concerns. The police chief was non-committal, insisting that while they would be present to maintain order, they couldn't guarantee that things wouldn't get out of hand. Jamal, who had been trying to stay strong throughout the ordeal, started to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew that the march was important, not just for him, but for the entire community. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that something might go wrong. The possibility of violence, the anger simmering just beneath the surface, and the fear of being targeted again. It was all becoming too much. In the days leading up to the march, Jamal found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, worried that he might be harassed or even attacked. The support from his community was overwhelming, but so was the hostility from those who saw him as a troublemaker. He tried to focus on the positive, on the strength and unity that the march represented, but the growing tension was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Pastor Davis and the other organizers were working tirelessly to ensure that the march would be safe and successful. They reached out to neighboring communities for support, hoping to draw a larger crowd that would deter any potential troublemakers. They also organized training sessions on nonviolent protest, teaching participants how to stay calm and peaceful in the face of provocation. The night before the march, Jamal sat in his room, staring at the flyers and signs that had been prepared for the event. He felt a mixture of fear and determination. This march was about more than just his arrest. It was about standing up against years of injustice, about demanding change in a town that had long ignored the voices of its black residents. He knew that the next day would be a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone involved. As he finally lay down to sleep, Jamal could hear the faint sound of distant voices outside, people gathering in anticipation of the march. The tension in the air was thick, but so was the sense of resolve. Whatever happened tomorrow, Jamal knew that he and his community were ready to face it together. The morning of the march dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the heavy mood that had settled over the town. Jamal woke up early, his heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and determination. He knew today would be a defining moment, not just for him, but for everyone who had stood by him during this difficult time. As he got ready, Jamal's thoughts drifted to the night before, when his mother had sat beside him, holding his hand in silence. She had always been a source of strength for him, and he could see the worry in her eyes. But she hadn't tried to dissuade him from marching. She knew how important this was. "Just be careful," she had whispered before kissing his forehead. Jamal had nodded, promising to stay safe. By the time Jamal arrived at the church, a large crowd had already gathered in the parking lot. People were holding signs with slogans like "Justice for Jamal," "End Police Brutality," and "Equality for All." The sight of so many people, black, white, young, and old, coming together to support the cause filled Jamal with a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this march could make a difference. Pastor Davis was at the front of the crowd, organizing last-minute details with the other leaders. When he saw Jamal, he walked over and put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You ready, son?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Jamal took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." The march began with a prayer led by Pastor Davis, asking for peace, strength, and justice. As the crowd bowed their heads, Jamal felt a surge of emotion. This was more than just a protest. It was a plea for change, a demand for recognition and respect. When the prayer ended, there was a brief moment of silence, and then the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the quiet morning. With Pastor Davis leading the way, the marchers began to move down the street. Jamal walked near the front, his heart racing as he took in the scene around him. People were chanting, "No justice, no peace," and "Black Lives Matter," their voices growing louder with each step. The sound of footsteps and the rustle of signs filled the air, creating a powerful sense of unity and purpose. As the march wound its way through the town, more people joined in. Some stood on their porches, watching in silence, while others clapped or held up their own signs in support. But there were also those who glared from behind closed windows or muttered under their breath as the marchers passed by. The tension was palpable, but the crowd remained peaceful, their focus unwavering. Jamal couldn't help but notice the police presence along the route. Officers stood at various intersections, watching the march with stern expressions. Jamal felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. What if something went wrong? What if the march was disrupted, or worse? But as he glanced at the people marching beside him, his friends, his neighbors, his community, he felt a renewed sense of courage. They were all in this together. As the march continued, the crowd began to swell. People from neighboring towns had come to show their support, and by the time they reached the town square, the crowd had grown to several hundred strong. The square, usually a quiet place, was now filled with the sound of chants, footsteps, and determination. When they reached the center of the square, Pastor Davis signaled for the crowd to stop. He climbed onto a small stage that had been set up, and Jamal followed him, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The noise of the crowd quieted as Pastor Davis took the microphone. "Today," Pastor Davis began, his voice strong and steady, "we stand together to demand justice, to demand equality, and to demand respect. We are here to say that we will not be silent in the face of injustice, that we will not back down in the face of oppression. We are here to say that Black Lives Matter." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, their voices carrying across the square. Jamal felt a swell of pride and emotion. This was more than he had ever imagined. It was a powerful statement, a declaration that they would not be ignored. Pastor Davis continued, his words resonating with the crowd. "But let us also remember that we march today not out of anger, but out of love. Love for our community, love for justice, and love for each other. Let us stand together, in peace and in strength, to demand the change that we deserve." As Pastor Davis finished speaking, the crowd began to chant again, their voices rising in unison. Jamal looked out over the sea of faces, feeling a sense of belonging and purpose. This was his community, and together they were making history. As the march continued, the tension in the town became more palpable. For some, the sight of so many people coming together to protest against injustice was inspiring. For others, it was a direct challenge to the status quo, a challenge that needed to be met with force. Officer Stevens, the very officer who had wrongfully arrested Jamal, stood at the edge of the town square, watching the marchers with a growing sense of unease. He had been on the force for over a decade, and he had seen protests before, but this one felt different. There was a sense of unity among the marchers, a determination that he hadn't seen in other protests. And there, near the front of the crowd, was Jamal, the young man he had humiliated just days before. As he watched Jamal lead the march, Officer Stevens felt a pang of guilt. The arrest had been unnecessary. He knew that now. But in the heat of the moment, fueled by his own biases and the pressure of the job, he had acted impulsively. Now, seeing the impact of his actions, he began to question everything. The other officers around him were tense, their hands resting on their batons, ready for anything. Stevens could sense their unease, their discomfort with the growing crowd. He glanced at his partner, Officer Daniels, who was watching the marchers with narrowed eyes. "Think they're gonna cause trouble?" Daniels muttered, his voice low. Stevens shook his head, though he wasn't entirely sure. "I don't know," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But we need to stay calm. We can't escalate things." Daniels snorted, clearly skeptical. "You saw what happened in the last town. These protests can turn violent fast." Stevens didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, on Jamal, on the arrest, on the possibility that he had been wrong. The memory of Jamal's face as he was handcuffed haunted him. There had been fear in the young man's eyes, yes, but also something else. Disappointment, maybe, or the painful recognition of a reality Jamal had likely faced too many times before. As the crowd chanted, "No justice, no peace," Stevens felt the words echo in his mind. What kind of justice had he served that day? What kind of peace was he preserving by keeping Jamal behind bars for something he didn't do? Stevens knew that the march would eventually reach the police station, where the protesters would likely demand action, accountability, maybe even his resignation. The thought made him sweat under his uniform. He wasn't ready for that kind of confrontation, especially not in front of the entire town. But as the marchers drew closer, he knew he had to make a decision. He could either continue to stand with his fellow officers, maintaining the same old order that had led to this moment, or he could take a step back and acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the protesters were right. He looked back at the marchers, now only a block away. Jamal was still at the front, his expression calm but resolute. Stevens knew that if he wanted to make things right, he needed to start by facing the young man he had wronged. Taking a deep breath, Officer Stevens unclipped his baton from his belt and handed it to Daniels. "I'm going to talk to him," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves tightening his chest. Daniels stared at him like he was crazy. "What? You're just going to walk up to them?" Stevens nodded. "Yeah, it's the least I can do." Without waiting for a response, Stevens began walking toward the marchers, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, or how Jamal would react, but he knew that this was a moment that could change everything, for both of them. As Officer Stevens approached the marchers, the chanting grew louder. The crowd was united, their voices rising together in a powerful call for justice. Stevens felt a lump in his throat as he scanned the sea of faces, many of them young, passionate, and determined to bring about change. But his eyes were drawn to one figure in particular, Jamal. Jamal noticed the officer stepping away from the line of police, moving toward the marchers. His heart skipped a beat, unsure of what was about to happen. The last time he had seen Officer Stevens, he had been forced into the back of a police car, humiliated and powerless. Now, as the officer walked toward him, Jamal couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: anger, fear, but also curiosity. What could Stevens possibly want now? The crowd began to notice Stevens as well, and the chanting faltered. People whispered to each other, wondering if there would be a confrontation. Some of the marchers tensed, ready to protect Jamal if necessary. Stevens could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the distrust and suspicion radiating from the crowd. He had to tread carefully. When Stevens finally reached Jamal, the two men stood face to face, the tension between them almost palpable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out as the crowd watched with bated breath. Jamal was the first to break the silence. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with the hurt and anger he had been carrying since the arrest. Stevens took a deep breath, searching for the right words. He knew that whatever he said next could either bridge the gap between them or widen it irreparably. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice low but sincere. "What I did to you was wrong. I made a snap judgment based on my own prejudices, and I let you down. I let this whole community down." Jamal blinked, surprised by the officer's words. He had expected anger, maybe even more aggression, but not an apology. The crowd around them murmured in confusion, unsure of how to react to this unexpected turn of events. Stevens continued, his eyes never leaving Jamal's. "I can't take back what I did, but I want to make it right. I want to listen, to understand, and to do better. But I need your help to do that." Jamal studied Stevens, trying to gauge his sincerity. There was something in the officer's eyes, regret, maybe even shame. Jamal had spent years feeling the sting of prejudice, of being treated as less than, but here was a man, a police officer no less, admitting that he had been wrong. It was a small step, but it was something. "Why should I trust you?" Jamal asked, his voice hard. "How do I know this isn't just for show?" Stevens nodded, understanding the skepticism. "You don't," he admitted, "and I can't blame you for that. But I'm here, standing in front of you, asking for a chance to prove that I can do better. Not just for you, but for everyone here." The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. They had come expecting a protest, a standoff with the police, but what they were witnessing was something different, something that could be the start of real change. Jamal thought for a moment, then finally nodded. "All right," he said, his voice firm, "but if you want to make things right, it can't just be words. It has to be action." Stevens nodded in agreement. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes." As the two men stood there, surrounded by the crowd, something shifted. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of cautious hope. For the first time in a long time, it felt like there might be a way forward, a way to bridge the divide that had separated them for so long. Following their intense conversation, Jamal and Officer Stevens began meeting regularly. At first, the meetings were brief and cautious, with both men feeling their way through this unexpected new relationship. They met in community centers, parks, and even occasionally in Jamal's home, where they discussed the deep-rooted issues plaguing their town. These conversations were not easy, often stirring up painful memories and difficult truths, but both men were committed to making a difference. Jamal was initially skeptical of Stevens' intentions, but over time, he began to see a genuine desire in the officer to learn and grow. Stevens asked questions about Jamal's experiences and listened intently to the answers, trying to understand the daily struggles and injustices that he and others in the black community faced. Jamal, in turn, learned more about Stevens' background, the pressures of being a police officer, and the internal conflicts Stevens had been grappling with since their first encounter. One day, during one of their meetings, Stevens brought up an idea that had been forming in his mind. "What if we start a community outreach program?" he suggested. "Something that brings the police and the community together, where we can have open conversations, build trust, and work on solutions together. Jamal considered the proposal. It was ambitious and would require a lot of work, but the potential impact could be huge. "What kind of program are you thinking?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Stevens leaned forward, his enthusiasm evident. "We could start with regular town hall meetings where people can voice their concerns directly to the police. We could organize community events, like sports days or neighborhood cleanups, where officers and residents work side by side. And we could set up mentorship programs, pairing officers with young people in the community to build positive relationships." Jamal nodded slowly, the idea taking shape in his mind. "That could work," he said. "But it has to be more than just a public relations stunt. People need to see real, lasting change. They need to feel safe and respected in their own community." "Absolutely," Stevens agreed. "And we need to make sure that the police are held accountable. That means more transparency, better training, and a commitment to fair and equal treatment for everyone." The two men spent hours hashing out the details, discussing potential obstacles, and brainstorming ways to get the community involved. They knew that convincing both the police department and the residents to support the program would be challenging, but they were determined to give it everything they had. As the days turned into weeks, their plan began to take shape. They reached out to local leaders, activists, and other residents to gather support. Some were hesitant at first, wary of trusting the police after years of mistreatment, but Jamal's involvement helped to ease their concerns. They knew Jamal was someone who genuinely cared about the community, and that he wouldn't back a plan unless he believed it could make a difference. Stevens, too, faced resistance within the police department. Some of his colleagues were skeptical, questioning his motives and the feasibility of the program. But Stevens stood firm, arguing that bridging the gap between the police and the community was essential for everyone's safety and well-being. Over time, he managed to win over a few key allies, officers who were also tired of the divide and eager to see real change. The first town hall meeting was scheduled for the following month, and as the date approached, both Jamal and Stevens felt a mix of excitement and nerves. They knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but they also knew that it was a crucial step toward healing the rift in their town. The day of the first town hall meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the town was charged with anticipation. Flyers had been distributed, social media had been buzzing, and word of mouth had spread the news of this unprecedented event. The town hall, usually a place for mundane council meetings and administrative tasks, was now transformed into a symbol of potential change. Jamal arrived early, wanting to ensure everything was in order. As he entered the building, he felt a wave of nervousness mixed with hope. This meeting represented more than just a conversation. It was a chance to start mending the deep-seated distrust between the black community and the police. The hall gradually filled with residents, a diverse mix of people from all walks of life. Some faces were familiar, friends and neighbors who had shared in the struggles and triumphs of the community. Others were new, people curious to see what would unfold, perhaps skeptical but willing to give this initiative a chance. Jamal noticed a few of the older residents, whose experiences of injustice stretched back decades, sitting together with cautious expressions. In the back of the room, a group of young people, full of energy and passion, whispered among themselves, eager to see if their voices would truly be heard. Officer Stevens arrived a little later, dressed in plain clothes rather than his uniform. He had debated whether to wear his badge or come as just another resident, and ultimately decided that the uniform might create a barrier he was trying to break down. He scanned the room, recognizing some of his fellow officers who had come to show support, as well as others who were simply curious. Stevens' heart raced as he made his way to the front, aware of the many eyes watching him closely. When the meeting began, Jamal took the stage first. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of years of unspoken pain and frustration. He spoke about the struggles the community had faced, the profiling, the harassment, and the systemic inequalities that had been allowed to fester for far too long. But he also spoke of hope, of the possibility that tonight could mark the beginning of a new chapter for everyone involved. "We are here," Jamal said, his voice clear and strong, "because we want change. Not just for us, but for our children, and for future generations. We have to start somewhere, and tonight, we're starting with an honest conversation. This is our chance to be heard, to share our experiences, and to work together to find solutions." The room was silent, the audience hanging on to his every word. When he finished, there was a moment of quiet before a few people began to clap, the applause quickly spreading throughout the hall. Next, Officer Stevens took the stage. He began by acknowledging the past mistakes of the police department and the impact they had on the community. His words were measured, each one carefully chosen to convey sincerity. He spoke about his journey, how meeting Jamal had forced him to confront his own biases and the flawed system he had been part of for so long. "I'm not here to make excuses," Stevens said, looking out at the crowd. "I'm here to listen and to learn. We can't change the past, but we can work together to create a better future. That starts tonight, with each of us being willing to have these difficult conversations." For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, a hand rose from the audience. An older woman, Mrs. Jenkins, who had lived in the town for over 50 years, stood up. Her voice was steady but filled with emotion as she recounted a story of her grandson being unfairly treated by the police just a few years ago. She had never spoken about it publicly before, but tonight felt like the right time. Her story was followed by another, and then another, as one by one, members of the community shared their experiences. Stevens listened, feeling the weight of each story, the pain behind the words, and the courage it took for these people to speak out. Jamal sat beside him, occasionally nodding in agreement, sometimes adding his own thoughts. The meeting stretched on into the night, the room filled with raw emotion, but also a sense of collective determination. As the meeting came to a close, Stevens took the microphone again. "Thank you for your honesty," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "This is just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do, but I'm committed to seeing this through. Let's take what we've heard tonight and use it to guide us forward." The audience began to disperse, some staying behind to talk, others heading home, deep in thought. Jamal and Stevens exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the work still to come, but also of the small victory they had achieved tonight. In the days following the town hall meeting, the effects of that night began to ripple through the community. Word spread quickly about the powerful stories shared, the unexpected vulnerability shown by both Jamal and Officer Stevens, and the genuine dialogue that had taken place. The meeting became a topic of conversation in homes, workplaces, and schools, with people discussing what it meant for their town and how they could contribute to the change that was now within reach. Local media picked up on the story, reporting on the town hall as a rare moment of unity and understanding between a community and its police force. Journalists interviewed attendees, capturing the emotions and reflections of those who had been present. For many, it was the first time they had felt hopeful about the future of race relations in their town. The meeting also sparked interest from neighboring towns and cities, where similar tensions existed. Community leaders from these areas began reaching out to Jamal and Stevens, seeking advice on how to hold their own town halls and start similar initiatives. What had begun as a small, local effort was now gaining momentum, inspiring others to take action and start their own conversations. Meanwhile, within the police department, the impact of the town hall was palpable. Officers who had previously been skeptical or indifferent found themselves questioning their own practices and attitudes. Stevens, who had earned a newfound respect from his colleagues, started holding informal discussions at the station, encouraging his fellow officers to share their thoughts and concerns. These sessions were not always easy, but they were necessary, helping to break down barriers and build a more empathetic police force. Jamal, on the other hand, found himself in a new role as a community leader. People began approaching him for guidance and support, recognizing his efforts to bridge the gap between the police and the black community. He started organizing follow-up meetings, where residents could continue to voice their concerns and work on actionable solutions. The community, once fractured by fear and mistrust, was slowly beginning to heal. However, the path forward was not without its challenges. There were still those who resisted change, clinging to old prejudices and viewing the town hall as nothing more than a symbolic gesture. Some community members felt that the progress was too slow, while others feared that the momentum would eventually fade. Jamal and Stevens knew that keeping the movement alive would require constant effort, patience, and resilience. Despite these challenges, the seeds of change had been planted. Jamal and Stevens remained committed to nurturing those seeds, knowing that real transformation would take time but believing that it was possible. The town hall had been a starting point, but the real work was just beginning. As the weeks passed, the community continued to evolve. The conversations sparked by the town hall meeting grew deeper and more frequent. People who had previously avoided discussing issues of race and policing were now engaging openly and honestly with their neighbors, colleagues, and even family members. The dialogue was not always easy, and there were still disagreements and misunderstandings, but the willingness to listen and learn was a significant step forward. Jamal and Officer Stevens remained at the forefront of these efforts. Jamal's leadership in the community was solidified, as he worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. He organized workshops on racial sensitivity, facilitated by experts, where residents and police officers could learn about the history and impact of racial bias. These sessions were eye-opening for many, revealing the deep-rooted issues that had shaped their town's culture and attitudes. Stevens, too, took on a more prominent role within the police department. He was appointed as the head of a new community relations task force, a group dedicated to improving the relationship between the police and the communities they served. Under his leadership, the task force implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural competence, aiming to prevent the kind of incidents that had sparked the initial conflict. The impact of these initiatives began to show in the day-to-day interactions between the police and the community. Residents reported feeling more comfortable approaching officers, and in turn, officers found themselves gaining a new perspective on the people they were sworn to protect. Trust, which had been eroded over years of tension and misunderstanding, was slowly being rebuilt. One of the most significant changes was the way the police department handled complaints and concerns from the community. Stevens introduced a new system that allowed residents to voice their grievances directly to the task force, ensuring that their issues were heard and addressed in a timely manner. This transparency helped to alleviate some of the suspicion and fear that had previously surrounded the police. Jamal and Stevens also began visiting local schools, speaking to students about the importance of community, respect, and understanding. Their partnership served as a powerful example of what could be achieved when people from different backgrounds and perspectives came together with a common goal. The students, many of whom had witnessed or experienced discrimination themselves, were inspired by their message and began to see the possibilities for change in their own lives. Despite the progress, both Jamal and Stevens were acutely aware that their work was far from over. The systemic issues they were tackling had deep roots, and the journey toward true equality and justice would be long and arduous. But they were committed to seeing it through, knowing that the changes they were helping to create would benefit not just their town, but future generations as well. The growing sense of understanding and unity within the community was a testament to what could be achieved through dialogue, empathy, and a shared commitment to justice. While there were still obstacles to overcome, the foundation had been laid for a more inclusive and equitable future. Months after the town hall meeting that had marked the beginning of a significant transformation, the impact of Jamal and Officer Stevens' efforts could be seen across the community. The changes were not just in policy or practice, but in the hearts and minds of the people. The town that had once been divided by fear and mistrust was now becoming a model of cooperation and mutual respect. The media took notice of the town's progress. What had started as a local issue quickly gained national attention. News outlets ran stories about the transformation, highlighting the unique partnership between Jamal and Stevens. The narrative shifted from one of conflict to one of hope, showing that real change was possible when people came together with a shared vision. Jamal's non-profit organization, originally focused on youth mentoring, expanded its scope. It became a hub for community advocacy, offering resources for those affected by discrimination and working to bridge gaps between different groups within the town. The organization's influence began to reach beyond the town's borders, inspiring similar initiatives in neighboring communities. Officer Stevens, once known primarily for his role in the controversial arrest, was now recognized as a leader in the movement for police reform. His work with the Community Relations Task Force earned him respect not only from his fellow officers, but also from the residents he served. The police department, under his guidance, became more transparent and accountable, setting an example for others to follow. The bond between Jamal and Stevens grew stronger as they continued to work side by side. They were frequently invited to speak at conferences, sharing their experiences and the lessons they had learned. Their message was clear: meaningful change required courage, collaboration, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The most profound impact, however, was seen in the younger generation. Inspired by the changes around them, they began to take an active role in shaping the future of their community. Students who had once felt disconnected and disempowered were now organizing events, participating in discussions, and advocating for their rights. The legacy of Jamal and Stevens' work was evident in the way these young people embraced their roles as the next generation of leaders. As the town continued to evolve, it became a symbol of what could be achieved through unity and perseverance. The journey had not been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but the foundation had been laid for a more just and equitable society. Years later, when people looked back on the events that had transformed their town, they remembered the courage of Jamal and Officer Stevens, two men who had put aside their differences to work toward a common goal. Their story became a source of inspiration, reminding everyone that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. And so, the town that had once been fractured by prejudice and fear became a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of empathy, understanding, and the belief that together, we can create a better world.